At 27,000 feet above occupied Germany, the sky was no longer blue. It was a thin, hostile void, colorless, airless, and lethal. On July 30, 1943, the temperature inside the tail section of a B-17 Flying Fortress plunged to minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Metal froze. Breath crystallized. Skin burned with cold. This was not an environment meant for survival, only endurance. At the very back of the bomber, sealed inside a fragile plexiglass bubble, sat Staff Sergeant Michael Aruth. He was 23 years old, but looked younger. Slight frame, narrow shoulders, a face that hadn't yet hardened into war. At 130 pounds, he was the smallest man on the aircraft. Alone in the tail position, he faced backward into the oncoming sky, cut off from the rest of the crew by distance, noise, and the thin aluminum skin of the aircraft. No one could see his face. No one could help him if something went wrong. From this position, death always came first. Through the frost-rimmed glass, Aruth scanned the horizon. At first, they were only dots, dark flecks against the pale stratosphere. Then the shapes sharpened. Messerschmitt fighters, more of them, 8, 10, 15. They assembled with discipline and patience, sliding into formation behind the bomber stream, not charging, waiting. To experienced crews, the sight was unmistakable. This was not a random encounter. This was a hunt. German fighter pilots had learned to move like predators. They circled outside gun range, studied their targets, chose their moment. They attacked not as individuals, but as a coordinated pack, diving, climbing, crossing paths to overwhelm defensive fire. Bombers that fell behind the formation became isolated. Isolated bombers died. Inside the aircraft, the intercom crackled to life. "Tail gunner, you see them?" Aruth's voice was calm when he answered. "I see them, sir." But his hands, wrapped around the twin 50 caliber gun handles, were already stiff from the cold. His oxygen mask hissed softly with every breath. He knew what was coming. Every tail gunner did. The enemy always came from behind. And when they did, the tail was the first to be hit and often the last to survive. As the Messerschmitts tightened their formation, closing the distance with deliberate precision, the sky itself seemed to contract. In that moment, suspended between earth and space, between doctrine and instinct, one young gunner faced a decision that would determine not just his survival, but the fate of everyone behind him. By the summer of 1943, the air war over Europe was approaching a breaking point. On paper, the United States Army Air Forces possessed one of the most heavily armed aircraft ever built. The B-17 Flying Fortress bristled with firepower: 13, 50 caliber machine guns, overlapping fields of fire, and a 10-man crew trained to defend the aircraft from every angle. American planners believed sheer defensive volume would protect the bomber formations. The theory was simple: massed firepower would make enemy interception too costly to sustain. Reality was far more brutal. Bomber losses were climbing at an unsustainable rate. Entire formations were being shredded before reaching their targets. Aircraft disappeared in columns of smoke and flame, falling out of the sky with crews still inside. During what became known as Black Week in October 1943, the 8th Air Force lost 140 heavy bombers in just 7 days. That was nearly 1,500 men killed, wounded, or captured in a single week. Statistically, the math was merciless. Loss rates hovered around 13% per mission. At that pace, no bomber group could survive long enough to complete a full tour of duty. Crews were being destroyed faster than replacements could be trained. The strategic bombing campaign, the core of America's plan to cripple Nazi Germany, was bleeding to death in the sky. The aircraft were not the problem. The men were not the problem. The doctrine was. Intelligence analysts pored over gun camera footage and after-action reports. Frame by frame, they tracked tracer paths, attack angles, firing distances. The conclusions were devastating. For every 100 rounds fired by bomber gunners, fewer than 2 struck an attacking fighter. A hit rate below 2%. Thousands of pounds of ammunition were being expended on every mission. Very little of it mattered. German pilots understood this weakness and exploited it with ruthless precision. They studied American defensive doctrine and learned exactly when bombers would open fire between 400 and 600 yards. The regulation engagement range drilled into every gunner during training. They simply attacked outside that envelope, closing fast, firing first, and breaking away before the bombers' guns could effectively track them. Head-on attacks became especially deadly. German fighters charged straight into the bomber formation at combined closing speeds exceeding 600 miles per hour, unleashing 20-millimeter cannon fire and rockets, then disengaging before the gunners could adjust their lead. The bombers absorbed the damage before they ever had a chance to respond. The Army Air Forces tried to adapt. They tightened formations to concentrate firepower, only to make the bombers easier targets for flak. They loosened formations to allow maneuvering, creating gaps fighters could exploit. Engineers added chin turrets and improved gun mounts. Instructors emphasized deflection shooting, teaching gunners to aim not at where the enemy was, but where it would be when the bullets arrived. The theory was flawless. The execution was impossible. Deflection shooting required split-second calculations under conditions no training environment could replicate: sub-zero temperatures, violent turbulence, oxygen deprivation, enemy fire tearing through the fuselage, and the knowledge that a single mistake meant death. At 600 yards, a German fighter could travel hundreds of feet during the bullet's flight time. Gunners were expected to lead targets by aircraft lengths, while their own bomber shuddered under attack. The doctrine assumed perfect calm in the middle of chaos. As losses mounted, the numbers told a story no one wanted to hear. Highly trained gunners were following the rules and dying anyway. Only 1 in 4 bomber crews was completing a full tour. The rest were dead, crippled, or imprisoned. The strategic bombing campaign was failing, not because Americans lacked courage or equipment, but because the system itself was broken. And deep in the tail of a single B-17, one young gunner was beginning to understand that survival would not come from obeying the manual, but from challenging it. By mid-1943, the evidence was undeniable. The problem was not bravery, and it was not technology. It was doctrine. The United States Army Air Forces had built their entire defensive philosophy around a single concept: deflection shooting. In theory, it was sound. In classrooms and firing ranges, instructors taught bomber gunners to lead fast-moving targets, calculating angles and distances so bullets and enemy aircraft would intersect in space. On chalkboards, the mathematics were elegant. In combat, they were lethal fiction. Deflection shooting demanded an impossible level of precision under the worst conditions human beings could endure. Gunners were expected to estimate range, angle, speed, and relative motion while wearing bulky gloves at 40 degrees AF, breathing through fragile oxygen systems, and absorbing violent turbulence. Their aircraft was not a stable platform. It shuddered under flak bursts, flexed under stress, and vibrated from 4 roaring engines. Every calculation had to be made in fractions of a second, while enemy fire ripped through aluminum skin around them. At a regulation engagement range of 400 to 600 yards, the physics worked against the gunner. A German fighter attacking at 300 miles per hour covered hundreds of feet during the bullet's flight time. To score a hit, a gunner had to aim multiple aircraft lengths ahead of the target, holding that invisible point in space while everything around him moved. Even a minor misjudgment rendered the shot useless. Training assumed calm. Combat delivered chaos. The doctrine also ignored a critical psychological reality: the attacker controls the engagement. German fighter pilots chose when and how to attack. They initiated contact, selected their angles, and dictated closing speeds. Bomber gunners, by contrast, were reactive. They waited, they tracked. They responded only after the enemy was already committed and already firing. This imbalance gave German pilots a decisive advantage. By the time a Messerschmitt entered the bomber's prescribed firing envelope, its cannons were already effective. The bomber, by doctrine, absorbed the first blows. Oxygen lines shattered. Control cables snapped. Engines flamed out. Gunners were wounded or killed before they ever fired a round. The defensive system was designed to respond after damage had already been inflicted. In effect, bomber crews were trained to fight while bleeding. German pilots learned this quickly. They studied American firing patterns and timed their attacks accordingly. Head-on passes exploited narrow firing windows. High-speed dives minimized exposure time. Coordinated attacks overwhelmed individual gun positions. The Luftwaffe didn't need to defeat the bomber's firepower, they simply needed to outpace it. The American response remained procedural. More training, more diagrams, more emphasis on proper technique. Gunnery manuals grew thicker. Instructors repeated the same rules with greater urgency. The assumption was that if gunners failed, it was because they lacked discipline, not because the rules themselves were flawed. But the statistics told a different story. Despite massive investments in training over 200,000 aerial gunners, hit rates remained below 2%. Losses continued to climb. Entire crews vanished mission after mission. Doctrine demanded faith, but faith was killing men. Another flaw ran deeper. Deflection shooting treated aerial combat as a mechanical problem, not a human one. It assumed pilots would press attacks rationally, ignoring fear, uncertainty, and instinct. In reality, fighter pilots were human beings operating on risk assessment. Increase the danger, and behavior changed. Reduce the danger, and attacks became bolder. The doctrine failed to exploit that truth. By waiting to fire until the optimal range, bombers surrendered initiative. They allowed German pilots to set up clean, confident attack runs. The system favored precision over disruption, accuracy over denial. And in air combat, disruption often mattered more than hits. Worst of all, the doctrine was insulated from correction. Those who wrote it had never fought in the tail of a bomber. They trusted equations over experience. Institutional momentum protected theory long after reality disproved it. As bomber losses mounted, the system demanded obedience rather than adaptation. But survival in war belongs to those who learn faster than the enemy. And in the frozen tail of a B-17, one gunner was beginning to understand a simple, dangerous truth. The bombers were losing because they were fighting by rules their enemy had already solved. Michael Lewis Aruth did not look like the kind of man who changed military doctrine. He did not arrive wrapped in credentials or polished authority. He came from the margins economically, socially, and institutionally, and that distance from the center would become his greatest strength. Aruth was born in 1919 in Springfield, Massachusetts, to Lebanese immigrant parents who lived paycheck to paycheck. His father worked long hours in a textile mill. His mother took in laundry. There was no safety net, no expectation of higher education, no path upward that did not require immediate contribution. During the Great Depression, survival mattered more than ambition. Aruth learned early that theory meant little if it could not feed a family. He attended technical high school but dropped out after 3 years. Not because he was incapable, but because time was a luxury he could not afford. School promised knowledge later, work provided food now. This decision permanently placed him outside the institutions that produced officers, instructors, and doctrine writers. He would never speak their language fluently. He would never fully trust them either. When Aruth entered the Army Air Forces in 1942, he did so without illusions. He did not romanticize service or idolize authority. To him, the military was a job, one that paid, fed, and offered structure in a collapsing economy. He followed orders, but he did not surrender his judgment. He absorbed training, but he did not worship it. That distinction mattered. At gunnery school, Aruth learned everything the manuals required: deflection angles, engagement ranges, burst discipline. He mastered the mechanics. He could strip and clear 50 caliber Browning in seconds. On paper, he was competent. But competence did not equal conviction. Even as instructors repeated formulas, Aruth noticed a disconnect between what was taught and what happened in the sky. Combat clarified that gap brutally. On his first missions, Aruth did exactly what he had been trained to do. He waited. He calculated. He fired controlled bursts at prescribed ranges. And he watched German fighters survive. He watched bombers fall apart around him. He watched men die while doing everything correctly. The doctrine asked him to trust it. Reality punished that trust. Aruth began to rely on something the system undervalued: direct observation. He noticed that German pilots were already firing by the time they entered the recommended engagement zone. He noticed that fighters reacted sharply to unexpected fire, even when it was inaccurate. He noticed hesitation, break-offs, and disrupted attack runs, moments the manuals never discussed. Most importantly, he noticed that fear altered behavior faster than bullets. Unlike trained theorists, Aruth did not feel obligated to defend the system. He had no reputation to protect, no doctrine to justify, no institutional loyalty beyond keeping his crew alive. His thinking was pragmatic, almost blunt. If a rule did not reduce casualties, it was wrong. If an action changed enemy behavior, it mattered even if it violated instruction. This mindset placed him outside the system long before he openly defied it. He did not convene meetings or write proposals. He did not argue doctrine. He tested his ideas the only way that mattered under fire. His lack of formal education, often seen as a deficiency, freed him from intellectual inertia. He was not constrained by precedent. He did not ask whether something was authorized. He asked whether it worked. In this way, Aruth embodied a recurring truth in military history: innovation rarely comes from the center. It comes from the edges, where failure is visible and consequences are immediate. Institutions preserve order. Individuals under pressure adapt. Aruth's insight was not revolutionary because it was complex. It was revolutionary because it was simple, and because no one with authority was willing to say it first. He saw that the enemy did not need to be destroyed to be defeated. It only needed to be denied confidence, timing, and control. By trusting what he saw instead of what he was told, Aruth crossed an invisible line. He became a problem for doctrine and a solution for survival. And in war, those two roles are often the same. The breakthrough did not arrive with permission. It arrived with defiance. On July 30, 1943, high above Germany, Michael Aruth faced a moment every combat soldier eventually encounters: the point where obedience and survival diverge. The Messerschmitts were forming up behind the bomber stream, their silhouettes sharp against the pale sky. The range was closing, but not yet within the sacred numbers drilled into him at gunnery school. 400 to 600 yards. That was the rule. That was the doctrine. That was when he was supposed to fire. Aruth did not wait. At approximately 900 yards, well outside the approved engagement envelope, he squeezed the triggers of his twin, 50 caliber machine guns. Tracers arced outward, stitching red lines across the empty air between bomber and fighter. By the book, it was wasteful. By regulation, it was wrong. By instinct, it was necessary. Inside the B-17, reactions were immediate and skeptical. Over the intercom, someone muttered that the tail gunner was burning ammunition again. Others assumed panic. To trained eyes, Aruth's fire made no sense. At that distance, hit probability was mathematically negligible. Ammunition was finite. Barrels overheated. Discipline mattered. That was what they had been taught. But something happened that the manuals had never measured. The German fighters reacted. Instead of holding formation and pressing their attack with clinical precision, the Messerschmitt pilots began to scatter. Their approach lost coherence. Attack runs became hesitant, uneven, disrupted. Pilots broke off early, rolled away, reformed at awkward angles, then tried again only to encounter the same wall of fire waiting for them. Aruth was not trying to score hits at 900 yards. He understood the math as well as anyone. What he was doing, consciously or not, was seizing the initiative. In air combat, initiative is everything. An attacking fighter pilot needs a stable approach, a predictable target, and a brief window of calm to line up a lethal shot. Aruth's early fire denied all three. The German pilots were forced to react before they were ready. Their attack profiles collapsed under psychological pressure. Fear entered the equation. Even the most experienced pilot is human. Tracers arriving earlier than expected trigger instinctive responses: flinching, jinking, breaking off to reassess. Every evasive maneuver costs time, fuel, and positioning. Every disrupted attack reduces lethality. Aruth's bullets did not need to hit to matter. They only needed to intrude. When the fighters finally pushed closer, crossing inside the traditional engagement zone, they entered a different battlefield than expected. They were already stressed, already off angle, already late. And Aruth was still firing. Now the geometry shifted decisively. At closer range, with German pilots forced through a continuous stream of fire rather than a brief, calculated exchange, hit probability rose sharply. What had begun as psychological disruption became physical destruction. Fighters flew into what was effectively a pre-established kill zone. Aruth abandoned another rule as well. He did not fire short, conservative bursts. He fired long, sustained streams, ignoring concerns about ammunition expenditure and barrel wear. His priority was dominance, not efficiency. Suppression mattered more than conservation. The cost was real. Ammunition drained rapidly. His guns overheated. Enemy fire found its mark. A cannon shell shattered his oxygen line. Another jammed one of his guns. Shrapnel tore into his shoulder. Any of these would have justified disengagement. Aruth stayed at his post. When the attack ended, 4 German fighters had been destroyed. The disbelief on the ground was immediate. Bomber gunners did not shoot down multiple enemy aircraft in a single mission. That was the domain of fighter aces. Intelligence officers questioned the claims. Doctrine resisted the implication. But the evidence, crew testimony, gun camera footage, ammunition logs forced a reckoning. What Aruth had done was not reckless. It was experimental, and it worked. His decision to fire at 900 yards violated established rules, but it revealed a deeper truth: those rules had missed. Air combat is not governed solely by ballistics. It is governed by psychology. Timing, surprise, and pressure can matter as much as accuracy. By breaking the law of the manual, Aruth rewrote the reality of the fight. That moment marked a turning point not just in his own combat record, but in how the 8th Air Force would eventually understand defensive fire. Initiative could belong to the defender. Aggression could be protection. And sometimes, survival demands the courage to fire before permission exists. History often celebrates innovation after it succeeds. In the moment, it looks like disobedience. Aruth pulled the trigger anyway. The climax of the mission did not arrive with a clean victory, or a triumphant call over the radio. It arrived in fragments, metal, fire, and failing breath high above enemy territory, where survival narrowed to seconds and willpower became the final weapon. By the time the German fighters committed to their second wave, Aruth was already wounded. A burst of cannon fire tore through the tail section of the bomber. Shrapnel ripped into his shoulder, sending a sharp, burning pain down his arm. Almost immediately, the oxygen line feeding his mask was severed. At 30,000 feet, the effect was brutal and fast. The world began to dim at the edges. His hands felt distant, heavy, as if no longer fully his own. Hypoxia does not announce itself with drama. It arrives quietly, seductively, stealing judgment and strength without warning. Protocol demanded he disengage. Wounded gunners were to report their condition. Oxygen loss required immediate corrective action. A jammed gun meant switching to the remaining weapon or abandoning the position. Any one of these failures justified retreat. Aruth faced all of them at once. One of his 50 caliber machine guns seized, the bolt locked mid-cycle by heat and debris. He struck it with his fist, then with the heel of his boot. Nothing. The second gun still functioned, but its barrel glowed faintly, pushed beyond safe operating limits. Every burst risked catastrophic failure. Outside, the Messerschmitts were coming in again. Through the fractured plexiglas, Aruth saw them line up, dark shapes growing rapidly larger, their nose cannons already flashing. The bomber shuddered as rounds struck the fuselage. Somewhere forward, an engine coughed and sputtered. Intercom chatter dissolved into static and clipped voices. The aircraft was still flying, but just barely. Aruth adjusted his stance, braced himself against the frame, and kept firing. Each pull of the trigger demanded more effort now. His vision tunneled. His breathing became shallow, rapid, ineffective. Without sufficient oxygen, fine motor control degrades first, but Aruth was no longer relying on finesse. He fired by instinct, by rhythm, by a deep refusal to yield his position. The German pilots pressed closer than before, sensing weakness. They had learned to expect early fire, but they did not expect it from a wounded gunner whose aircraft was visibly damaged. That miscalculation proved fatal. At close range, Aruth's sustained fire found its mark. One fighter burst into flame, rolling violently away before vanishing beneath the cloud layer. A second aircraft broke apart mid-dive, debris scattering across the sky. A third took hits along the wing route, stalled and spiraled downward, uncontrollable. The fourth kill came moments later, almost unnoticed: a flash, a sudden absence where an attacker had been. 4 enemy fighters destroyed in a single mission. By any statistical measure, it was impossible. Bomber gunners were expected to defend, not dominate. Yet Aruth had done more than survive. He had reshaped the engagement entirely. The attacking formation collapsed. The remaining German pilots disengaged, their assault broken not by superior numbers, but by unrelenting resistance. Inside the bomber, the cost was evident. Blood pooled on the deck plates. Smoke lingered in the cold air. Systems failed one by one. Aruth slumped briefly against the gun mount, his strength fading, consciousness flickering. Crew members later recalled his silence not fear, not panic, but exhaustion beyond words. When the aircraft finally limped back toward friendly territory, it did so because the tail had held. Medical teams rushed him from the plane after landing. He was hyposick, wounded, barely coherent. Only later, when reports were filed and claims verified, did the magnitude of what had happened become clear. 4 confirmed victories. 1 gunner. 1 mission. This was not a moment of glory in the cinematic sense. There was no cheering crowd, no instant recognition. There was only a quiet understanding among those who studied the encounter. The battle had reached its breaking point, and one man had refused to yield when every variable turned against him. In the frozen sky over Germany, wounded, suffocating, and nearly unarmed, Aruth had fought through the limits of doctrine, physiology, and probability itself. That was the climax not just of a mission, but of an idea. That even in industrial war, at the edge of machines and numbers, the outcome can still hinge on human resolve. The aftermath of the mission did not unfold in the sky, it erupted on the ground, inside briefing rooms, training manuals, and command conferences. What Aruth had done in combat challenged more than enemy aircraft. It challenged doctrine itself. And institutions, especially military ones, do not yield easily to contradiction. At the heart of the controversy was doctrine. For years, bomber defense training had been built around a single-premise deflection shooting. Gunners were taught to lead fast-moving fighters, calculate angles under pressure, and fire short, controlled bursts at targets crossing their field of view. It was mathematically sound, academically rigorous, and disastrously fragile in real combat. Training commands believed this was the only professional method. Anything else was dismissed as crude, wasteful, or reckless. Aruth's approach violated that orthodoxy outright. Opening fire from extreme range nearly 900 yards was considered pointless at best, dangerous at worst. Ammunition expenditure was tightly regulated. Overheating barrels, reduced accuracy, and the risk of friendly fire were cited repeatedly by instructors. From the perspective of the training establishment, Aruth had not demonstrated innovation. He had demonstrated indiscipline. The reaction was swift. At training centers and gunnery schools, instructors openly criticized the incident reports. They argued that the kills were either exaggerated, coincidental, or unrepeatable. Anecdote is not evidence became the refrain. One senior trainer reportedly stated that teaching such methods would turn bomber defense into chaos. Manuals were not revised. Simulators were not updated. On paper, nothing changed. But at the front, the response was very different. Combat commanders did not have the luxury of theoretical purity. They lived with daily loss reports, empty bunks, and aircraft that failed to return. To them, Aruth's engagement was not an outlier, it was a data point written in blood. Fighter pilots disengaged earlier. Attack formations broke sooner. Survivability increased when gunners fired early, aggressively, and continuously. The divide widened into a classic institutional conflict: training versus combat. Training commands argued from controlled environments, ideal conditions, and statistical models. Combat leaders argued from wreckage, funerals, and hard-earned intuition. One side demanded proof before change. The other demanded change before more men died. This tension forced the issue upward. The matter reached senior operational leadership officers, who understood both doctrine and reality. They reviewed gun camera footage, damage assessments, and after-action reports. Patterns emerged. Missions where gunners fired earlier showed disrupted enemy attack profiles. German pilots were breaking off sooner, forced to maneuver defensively instead of lining up clean shots. The psychological impact was undeniable. German fighter doctrine relied on closing distance before firing, maximizing hit probability against large bomber formations. Early long-range fire shattered that rhythm. It created uncertainty. Pilots could no longer assume a safe approach window. Even if the rounds did not hit, they forced evasive action, spoiling attacks before they fully developed. Still, institutional resistance remained strong. Changing doctrine meant admitting that years of training had been flawed. It meant rewriting manuals, retraining instructors, and conceding that experience from a so-called non-conforming gunner had exposed systemic weakness. Militaries are built to resist such admissions. So leadership chose a compromise. They would not rewrite doctrine overnight. They would test it. The decision was quiet, deliberate, and crucial. Selected bomber groups were authorized unofficially at first to allow gunners to fire at extended ranges during missions. No press releases, no sweeping announcements, just operational latitude. Commanders were told to observe, record, and report. Test it was the order. What followed was not immediate revolution, but steady confirmation. Enemy attack patterns shifted. Loss rates declined incrementally. Crews reported greater confidence. Gunners felt proactive rather than reactive. Bombers no longer waited passively for impact, they contested the airspace around them. The results spoke louder than arguments ever could. Within months, what had been controversial began to feel inevitable. Training commands slowly adjusted language. Tactical bulletins circulated. Deflection shooting remained in manuals, but it was no longer sacred. Early fire was acknowledged as valid, even effective. Aruth was never formally credited as a doctrinal architect. Institutions rarely celebrate those who disrupt them. But the shift was real. The machine had absorbed the anomaly and adapted. This was not just a tactical debate, it was a lesson in how change enters rigid systems. Not through theory, not through permission, but through undeniable results under fire. Doctrine had been challenged. Doctrine had resisted. And doctrine finally had been forced to bend. What finally ended the debate was not personality, reputation, or rhetoric. It was numbers. War at its highest level is not decided by belief, it is decided by data. And once the early fire doctrine spread beyond a single crew, beyond a single mission, the statistics began to speak with a clarity that doctrine could no longer ignore. After the quiet tested authorization, multiple bomber groups across different theaters began to apply the same principle, engage enemy fighters earlier, at longer distances, with sustained fire. This was not a coordinated experiment at first. It was organic adoption. Crews talked. Combat reports circulated informally. Survivors shared what worked, and patterns emerged. Units that embraced early engagement consistently reported fewer successful enemy attack runs. German fighters were being forced to maneuver defensively far sooner than planned. Their classic tactics, head-on passes, tight closing spirals, precise deflection shots, were disrupted before they could fully develop. Instead of choosing their angles, they reacted to suppressive fire. Loss rates reflected this shift. Comparative mission data showed that bomber formations using early, continuous fire experienced noticeably lower aircraft loss percentages than those adhering strictly to traditional deflection doctrine. The difference was not marginal. In some units, losses dropped by double digits over a series of missions. Damaged aircraft increased but destroyed aircraft decreased. Crews were coming home. This distinction mattered. A damaged bomber could be repaired. A destroyed bomber meant a dead crew. Gun camera footage reinforced the statistics. Analysts observed German fighters breaking off attacks earlier, often without firing. In many cases, the mere volume of incoming fire forced them to abandon optimal firing positions. Even when no kills were recorded, attacks were degraded, and degraded attacks saved lives. What made this data impossible to dismiss was consistency. The results repeated across different bomber groups, different crews, different days, and different enemy units. This was no longer a single gunner's instinct or an isolated battlefield anomaly. It was a reproducible effect. Early fire did not rely on extraordinary skill. It relied on timing, volume, and psychology. That last factor, psychology, proved critical. German fighter pilots were trained to expect a specific engagement envelope. Early fire shattered that expectation. Reports from captured pilots and intelligence intercepts confirmed increased caution, hesitation, and altered approach patterns. Fear crept into calculations. Surprise was lost. Initiative shifted. Statistically, this translated into fewer clean attack runs per sortie. Training commands attempted to argue correlation versus causation, but operational analysts countered with longitudinal data. Over successive months, as early fire practices expanded, bomber survivability improved even as missions grew longer, deeper, and more dangerous. Enemy defenses intensified. Targets moved closer to heavily defended airspace, yet losses did not rise proportionally. That broke the argument. If early fire were merely lucky, its effect would have dissipated with scale. Instead, it strengthened. The larger the sample size, the clearer the trend. What had once been dismissed as wasteful ammunition expenditure proved to be an efficient trade, bullets for lives. Eventually, official recognition followed. Tactical bulletins acknowledged the effectiveness of long-range suppressive fire. Training language softened. Instructors began teaching flexibility instead of rigidity. Deflection shooting remained a skill but no longer the only acceptable truth. Crews were encouraged to think, to adapt, to engage early when conditions favored it. The doctrine did not collapse. It evolved. And with that evolution came a deeper institutional lesson: battlefield reality is the ultimate laboratory. No manual survives first contact unchanged. No theory outweighs repeated survival. What made this moment significant was not just improved numbers, it was the shift in mindset. The military accepted that data generated by combat crews, even those outside traditional academic pathways, could reshape strategy. Experience was elevated to evidence. The phrase "it's just luck" disappeared from serious discussion. Luck does not scale. Luck does not repeat. Luck does not generate trends. What the data proved was simple and devastating: early fire worked. It reduced losses. It altered enemy behavior. It saved crews. And once proven by numbers, it could no longer be ignored. In war, belief can start a revolution. But only data can finish it. The legacy of this shift did not end with a single aircraft, a single gunner, or a single war. It rewired how air combat was understood, how survival, not just victory, was engineered into doctrine. Once early engagement proved its value, air combat philosophy began to change at a structural level. Doctrine, once rigid and centralized around textbook geometry, slowly pivoted toward a more adaptive model. The emphasis moved away from perfect shots and toward disruption. The objective was no longer simply to destroy the enemy, it was to deny them the conditions required to destroy you. This was a profound transformation. In the immediate term, bomber doctrine evolved. Crews were no longer instructed to wait passively for the ideal firing window. They were encouraged to recognize initiative as a weapon. Early fire became an accepted tool for breaking enemy attack sequences before they matured. Suppressive fire, once dismissed as wasteful, was reframed as a form of defensive maneuvering performed with guns instead of engines. This mindset carried directly into the B-29 era. The B-29 superfortress, operating at higher altitudes and deeper ranges, faced a different threat environment, but the same underlying truth applied. Enemy fighters still relied on approach geometry, timing, and concentration. Defensive systems on the B-29 were designed with this lesson embedded: centralized fire control, overlapping fields of fire, and the ability to engage attackers before they reached optimal positions. The philosophy was clear: deny the enemy the moment they needed most. This logic did not remain confined to bomber formations. It became foundational to modern air defense. Ground-based anti-aircraft systems, missile defense networks, and even radar doctrine adopted the same principle: early detection, early engagement, layered disruption. The goal shifted from reactive interception to proactive denial. Engage early to survive became more than a tactic. It became a worldview. In the Cold War, this thinking expanded further. Interceptor aircraft were designed to engage threats long before visual contact. Surface-to-air missiles prioritized range and tracking over last-second lethality. Even naval defense systems embraced preemptive engagement zones, understanding that the best defense was one that never allowed the enemy to stabilize. At its core, this was the same lesson learned in the bomber skies over Europe. Initiative equals survival. The legacy also reshaped how militaries thought about human judgment. The success of early engagement forced institutions to confront an uncomfortable truth: battlefield innovation often comes from those closest to danger, not those farthest from it. Doctrine became more flexible. Feedback loops between combat units and training commands tightened. Adaptation was no longer seen as insubordination, it became a requirement. This cultural shift mattered. Modern military doctrine increasingly emphasizes decision-making under uncertainty, decentralized execution, and real-time adaptation. Pilots, operators, and commanders are trained not just to follow procedures, but to understand intent. The objective is not perfect compliance, but effective outcomes. That philosophy traces a direct line back to this moment. There was also a psychological inheritance. Early engagement acknowledged fear not as weakness, but as a factor to be managed. By forcing the enemy to react sooner, initiative-induced hesitation, doubt, and stress. Modern warfare recognizes this openly. Information warfare, electronic disruption, and preemptive maneuvering all seek to overload the enemy's decision cycle. Break their rhythm, break their plan, break their confidence, survival follows. Perhaps the most enduring legacy, however, is philosophical. The idea that waiting for perfection is dangerous. That restraint, when mistaken for discipline, can become vulnerability. That in combat as in systems, economics, and life, those who act first often define the terms of engagement. This does not mean recklessness. It means understanding timing as a weapon. Today's air combat simulations, engagement envelopes, and rules of engagement all reflect this evolution. The question is no longer when is the perfect shot. It is when does the enemy lose control of the situation. That is the real victory condition. What began as a contested battlefield insight became a strategic principle with global reach. From bomber formations to missile defense grids, from World War II to the modern age, the logic persists. Engage early. Disrupt first. Survive longer. In war, as history repeatedly proves, survival is not passive. It is claimed. After the war, Michael Aruth did not become a symbol, a spokesperson, or a public hero. He did not tour lecture halls, write memoirs, or allow his name to be turned into legend. When the noise ended and the skies grew quiet, he went home. Back to Springfield, Massachusetts. There, he did what millions of veterans tried to do. He lived. He married, raised a family, worked an ordinary job, and spoke little about the years when the world had burned beneath his guns. The medals he earned, the Distinguished Service Cross, the Purple Heart, the Air Medal, were not displayed. They rested in drawers, not because they lacked meaning, but because for Aruth, they represented memories he did not wish to relive. He never argued that he had saved lives. He never demanded recognition for changing doctrine. He never corrected those who did not know his story. His silence was not bitterness. It was humility. And that, perhaps, is what makes his legacy human. Aruth understood something that transcends warfare, that courage does not require applause, and that truth does not need permission. When doctrine failed, he trusted what he saw with his own eyes. When authority said wait, he acted. Not out of rebellion but out of responsibility. He did not break the rules to be different. He broke them because following them was getting people killed. That distinction matters. His story reminds us that independent thinking is not arrogance. It is a moral obligation when lives are at stake. Institutions, by their nature, move slowly. They rely on averages, procedures, and assumptions. But reality is lived one moment at a time, by individuals who must decide whether to obey or adapt. Aruth chose adaptation. The lesson is timeless. Whether in war, science, leadership, or everyday life, progress often comes from those willing to question inherited wisdom, from people who are close enough to the problem to feel its consequences and brave enough to act before permission is granted. Yet courage alone was not enough. Aruth paired instinct with observation, aggression with purpose, and action with restraint. He did not fire early out of panic. He fired early to seize initiative. That balance between boldness and clarity is what separates recklessness from leadership. In the end, his greatest achievement was not the number of aircraft he shot down. It was the number of people who came home because someone dared to think differently. He never asked to be remembered. But he deserves to be. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that real heroes are often quiet, overlooked, and deeply human, consider subscribing to the channel. These stories survive only if they are told. Share your thoughts in the comments. Do you think modern systems still struggle to listen to those on the front lines? And which forgotten hero should we remember next? History is not just made by those who follow orders. Sometimes, it is shaped by one person who chooses to think and act on their own.